The war had no beginning, anyone still remembered, and for a long time it seemed it would have no ending either. The Doomslayer had walked through so many layers of hell that the color red had lost its meaning to him. Skies bled, rivers bled, mountains bled. He no longer counted the dead, because counting required a mind willing to look back, and he had trained himself long ago to look only forward. The final archdemon of that campaign fled through a wound in reality. A tear it had opened in desperation when it realized no fortress and no legion could shield it from the armored figure closing behind. The rift did not lead where the demon intended. It bent, split, and screamed against itself, and when the Slayer stepped through, the heat of hell was gone. In its place came a cold that felt older than fire. He emerged into a forest wrapped in permanent twilight. Storm clouds moved slowly overhead like the breathing of something vast and asleep. Moonlight fell in thin silver threads between crooked branches, and each tree seemed to lean inward, as if listening. The silence was not empty, it was patient. It was the kind of silence that had waited centuries for a footstep to disturb it, and now studied his with quiet fascination. The demon he had pursued lay somewhere ahead, wounded, bleeding, dragging itself through undergrowth that whispered names in languages no living tongue still spoke. The Slayer walked after it without hurry. He had learned that hurry was a kind of hope, and hope had abandoned him long ago. The creatures of this land felt him before they saw him. Wolves twisted by dark magic slunk between roots, their yellow eyes reflecting an armored silhouette they could not classify. Night creatures paused mid-feast. A pale vampire crouched atop a broken shrine, one hand pressed to the stone, and felt through it a presence that made the shrine itself tremble. None of them attacked. Instinct, older than their curses, warned them that this was not prey, not a rival, not even a hunter. This was something that hell had tried to keep, and failed. By the time dawn should have come, though dawn never truly came here, rumors had already begun to spread. A village woodsman found a clearing littered with corpses of things he had feared his entire life. Their wounds were clean, precise, and utterly without magic. In another hollow, an entire pack of hellhounds had been reduced to smoldering ruin, and the earth beneath them had cooled without any spell to bind it. The peasants crossed themselves and spoke of an angel. The priests spoke of a demon. The Belmonts, when word reached them, spoke of neither. Far above the forest, at the summit of a black mountain, Dracula's castle woke slowly from its long dreaming. Living walls shifted with a groan that echoed through corridors no map had ever charted. Ancient staircases rearranged themselves to face a direction they had never faced before. Forgotten spirits stirred in tapestries and mirrors, uncertain whether to hide or bow. Even the throne, carved from obsidian and old grief, felt the tremor of an approaching soul it could not read. Death himself lifted his gaze from the parchment of centuries. He had witnessed the arrival of many warriors, many heroes, many fools. He had catalogued every kind of courage and every kind of despair. Yet this new presence resisted his measure. The armored stranger radiated no fear, no ambition, no prayer, only purpose, cold and complete. By the time the Slayer reached the great gates of the castle, the forest behind him had fallen entirely quiet. Every creature that had watched his passage now understood something they could not explain to one another. The old rules of the night were shifting. Before he could set his hand upon the iron, a figure stepped from the shadow of the gate. A vampire hunter, cloak damp with rain, weapons drawn, eyes narrowed. He had come expecting monsters. He found something the legends had never prepared him for. The hunter's name was Trevor of the Belmont line, and he had spent his entire life learning the geometry of monsters. He knew the reach of a werewolf's claw, the arc of a vampire's leap, the exact instant a night creature would falter beneath silver. Yet standing before this armored stranger, none of his measurements held. The figure did not breathe like a beast. It did not radiate the corruption of the undead. It simply waited, patient as a mountain. And Trevor understood at once that his silver and his prayers would be nothing more than gestures against it. He struck first anyway, because a Belmont did not survive by hesitating. His whip cracked through the rain, wrapped around a gauntleted arm, and pulled taut. The armored figure did not move. Trevor might as well have tried to drag down a cathedral. The whip slid free without violence, and the stranger studied him with a helm that revealed nothing. Before either could measure the other further, the forest broke open behind them. Night creatures spilled from the trees in a wave of teeth and shrieking wings. Drawn perhaps by the castle's unrest, perhaps by the wounded archdemon still bleeding somewhere in the underbrush, Trevor turned, whip snapping, holy water shattering against pale flesh. He fought as his ancestors had fought, with discipline and with fear well managed. The stranger fought differently. There was no ritual to it, no flourish, no invocation. He moved through the horde like a storm through wheat. A creature lunged, and its skull was gone. Another leapt from the branches, and its body struck the earth in halves that had never learned they were separated. Trevor had seen his grandfather kill a chimera once. That had felt like art. This felt like arithmetic. The stranger was solving the forest. When the last body fell, Trevor lowered his whip and drew a slow breath. Rain hissed against the armor before him, steaming faintly where demon blood still clung. He spoke for the first time, and his voice was quieter than he had intended. "You do not serve the castle." The helm turned toward him. There was no answer, but Trevor felt the answer in the silence. He nodded once, sheathing what needed sheathing, and gestured toward the towering gates. Together, without pact or promise, they entered. The castle received them the way a spider receives a fly. Corridors stretched impossibly long. Portraits on the walls turned their painted eyes to follow. A staircase led upward into a chapel that should have been 3 floors below. Trevor recognized the tricks. He had studied them since boyhood. The castle fed on fear, on doubt, on the slow erosion of the mind. It offered mirrors that showed one's worst hour. It offered doors that opened into the day one had failed a loved one. None of it caught upon the slayer. He walked through illusions as though they were morning fog. A cursed door refused to open, and he removed it from its frame. A hallway rearranged itself, and he chose a new hallway. A guardian of stone and iron descended from an alcove with a roar meant to wither armies. And he answered the roar by stepping into it and reducing the guardian to gravel. The castle, for the first time in its long memory, encountered a visitor it could not frighten. And a place designed entirely around fear cannot easily understand what to do with someone who has none. Somewhere in the highest tower, death paused above a scrying pool. The ripples showed him a warrior he could not weigh. He set aside his scythe and drew instead an old book bound in skin, and began altering the castle from within, searching for a weakness that was not made of stone. Far below, in his throne of obsidian, Dracula listened to his own walls whisper. He had ruled here for centuries, and he knew the sound of his kingdom's unease. 2 hunters had entered his home. One he understood. The other, he realized with a slow and terrible curiosity, might understand him. Death did not descend directly. That was not his way. He was patience given a robe, and patience preferred to send others first. From the deep vaults beneath the castle, he loosed the old guardians, the ones Dracula kept sealed because even Dracula did not enjoy their company. Creatures that had outlasted crusades, beasts that had drunk from the wounds of saints. Things whose names the Belmonts had erased from their family archives, believing forgetting was a form of protection. The first of them met the slayer in a hall of black glass. It regenerated faster than any weapon should have been able to answer, its wounds closing before the sound of the strike had faded. The slayer studied it for exactly the length of a breath, then destroyed the pillars that held the ceiling, and the ceiling did what iron could not. Trevor watched, whip loose in his hand, and understood he was no longer measuring monsters. He was measuring the man beside him. The second guardian bent time. It moved between seconds, appearing in 3 places at once, laughing in a voice that echoed from Trevor's own childhood memories. The slayer did not chase it. He waited, still as scripture, and when the creature tried to strike from behind, it discovered that the armored figure had been waiting behind, not in front. Trevor could not explain what he had just seen. He decided he did not need to. The third took the shape of Trevor's mother. He had buried her when he was 10. She wore the same dress. She spoke with the same weariness. Trevor's hand shook. The slayer stepped between them without ceremony and ended the illusion with a certainty that felt almost gentle. Trevor did not thank him. He did not need to. He simply walked on, and his hand steadied. Yet victory was not free. Trevor began to notice what he had not allowed himself to notice before. The Slayer bled, not much, a dark seep beneath a plate of armor. A limp so slight it might have been imagined. A dent in the pauldron where a guardian's claw had found purchase. The armored giant was not invincible. He was merely unwilling to stop. That distinction, Trevor realized, was the entire secret of him. Death met them at last in a chamber shaped like a cathedral turned inside out. He did not lift his scythe. He lifted his hand, and the walls became memory. The Slayer stood at the center of a slow and patient cruelty. Worlds he had failed to save unfolded around him. A moon splitting above a city he had loved. Comrades kneeling in ash, calling a name that was once his. Wars without end, without meaning, without mercy. Death had learned that every warrior carried a wound he refused to look at, and Death had built his art around finding those wounds. The Slayer paused. For the first time in centuries, he paused. It was not fear. Trevor saw that clearly. It was something worse for Death's purposes. It was remembrance. The Slayer looked upon his lost worlds not with despair, but with the tired recognition of an old traveler seeing familiar ruins. The pause lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, long enough for Death to slip backward into the folds of his own robe and vanish. When the visions cleared, Trevor found the armored figure standing exactly as before. But Death, in the corridors he alone could walk, was troubled. He had reached inside the stranger and found no despair to grasp, no hidden shame, no unhealed grief he had not already accepted. There was nothing to weaponize. A being who had already survived everything Dracula could threaten, and worse. In his throne room, Dracula rose. He set aside the goblet he had not been drinking from. He looked toward the doors he had not opened in 100 years. He spoke softly to no one and to everyone. He does not leave this castle alive. Yet far beneath the foundations, in a place even Dracula had never mapped, something older than the castle began, quietly, to wake. Trevor felt the tremor first. A shudder beneath the floor, faint as a heartbeat heard through stone. He had lived in castles all his life, and he knew the difference between a building settling and a building remembering. This was the second kind. They followed the tremor downward. The stairs were not on any Belmont map, and Trevor's map was old enough that its ink had faded twice. Yet the castle offered the path almost eagerly, as if the castle itself was tired of guarding what lay below. Torches lit as they passed, but their flames were pale and reluctant, as though drawn from a candle that had already burned once for someone else. The chamber they entered was a cathedral, or the memory of one. Its arches predated any architecture Trevor recognized. There were no crosses, no saints, no icons of any faith he had studied. Instead, the walls were carved with murals whose paint had turned to dust and whose lines remained cut into the stone with a precision that felt patient rather than skilled. Trevor lifted his lantern and stopped breathing. The murals depicted a war. Not the war between vampires and hunters, not the war between men and beasts. A war between armored figures and creatures that Trevor had only ever seen in the Slayer's wake. Demons with too many limbs, beasts of fire and iron, cities burning under skies that did not belong to this world. And standing against them, in every panel, was a warrior in heavy armor, faceless behind a helm, weapons raised. He turned slowly to the figure beside him. The armor in the murals was not identical. The centuries had shifted its shape, but the silhouette was unmistakable. The stance, the weight, the way the figure stood between the innocent and the horde, as though he were a wall placed there by something older than kings. Trevor did not know whether these were ancestors of the Slayer, or previous champions of the same duty, or echoes of a single soul spread across many worlds. He suspected the truth was more troubling than any of these guesses. He suspected hell had touched this world long before Dracula raised his first stone. He suspected the demons Dracula commanded were not his own inheritance but borrowed rot from a deeper cellar. And he suspected the castle above him had been built, unknowingly, upon the grave of a war it did not remember losing. The Slayer stood before one panel for a long time. He did not speak. He did not gesture. But Trevor, who had learned to read silence in the last day more than in his entire life, understood that the armored giant recognized something. Above them in the throne room, Dracula's scholars laid down their books, Their eldest, a withered vampire who had once been a monk before he had been anything else, closed his eyes and spoke the conclusion aloud so that Dracula would not have to read it. If he reaches the heart of the castle ends. Not defeated, not conquered, ended. The magical foundations that had allowed the castle to rise from every defeat, to reassemble from every burning, would collapse in the presence of a soul that stood outside their laws. Dracula had built his eternity upon rules the Slayer simply did not acknowledge. Dracula was silent for a long while. He thought of the wife he had lost. He thought of the son who had turned against him. He thought of the centuries he had spent believing suffering was the only honest religion. He thought, finally, of what waited beneath his own throne, sleeping in a chamber he had sealed and then forgotten he had sealed. The ground shook again. This time it did not stop. In the cathedral below, dust fell from the ceiling in slow lines. Trevor braced himself against a pillar. The Slayer turned toward a doorway that had not been there a moment before. Something was breaking its seal. Neither Dracula nor the Slayer had touched it. The castle was remembering blood far older than either of them. The seal broke without ceremony. Old evils rarely announce themselves. They simply arrive, and the world learns their names by surviving them. What emerged from beneath the cathedral was not a demon in the shape the Slayer knew, nor a vampire in any tradition the Belmonts had catalogued. It was older, and its oldness felt like weather. It did not walk into the chamber. It became the chamber. The pillars remembered themselves as its ribs. The ceiling remembered itself as its skull. Stones that had rested for 1,000 years lifted and rearranged into a body that had many bodies. Trevor did not run. He wanted to. He mastered the wanting. He had been taught by his father that courage was not the absence of the impulse to flee, but the disciplined refusal of it. He raised his whip and stood beside the armored giant, and together they retreated up the stair they had descended, because retreat in this moment was not surrender. It was the gathering of terrain. Above, the castle unmade itself, corridors folded inward, towers tilted into dimensions that had no proper names. Night creatures that had served Dracula for centuries fled through the gates in packs, screaming in tongues that had never been meant for open air. Vampires who had believed themselves gods of small courts abandoned their thrones and ran. For the first time in the memory of any surviving chronicler, the monsters of hell were the ones running. Dracula met them in a shattered hall. He wore no crown. He carried no sword drawn. He looked, Trevor thought, tired, not weakened, tired. As a father is tired when he must at last admit the house he built is on fire, he spoke to the Slayer without preamble. We do not have to like one another. We have to stand in the same direction. The Slayer did not answer. He did not need to. He turned toward the deepening dark, and Dracula turned with him, and the alliance was made without oath or handshake. It was a fragile thing. Every step revealed its cracks. Trevor lost 2 companions in the first hour, Belmont cousins who had come when word reached the countryside that the castle was falling. Their names would be carved on a wall somewhere in a village that no longer existed by the end of the day. Ancient relics that had passed through Trevor's family for generations shattered against enemies that did not respect the metaphysics they had been forged under. Entire villages, glimpsed through breaches in the collapsing dimensions, simply were not there anymore. The Slayer bled more than Trevor had ever seen him bleed. He fought against things that existed sideways to the physical world, things that had to be answered on their own terms. And the Slayer, who had spent an eternity refining a single instrument, adapted with a speed that felt almost like grief. He tore weapons from the primordial's own body and used them against it. He walked through walls that were not walls to reach flanks that were not flanks. Yet each victory left another dent in his armor, another slow line of dark blood beneath a plate. Death moved through the chaos with quiet intent. Trevor caught sight of him once, standing calm amid a corridor that was tilting sideways, and understood at once that Death was not fighting for Dracula. Death was measuring. Death believed the awakened horror could be commanded. If only the right servant offered himself. Death intended to be that servant and to replace his old master when the dust settled. The betrayal did not need to be announced. It was felt. A door that should have opened did not. A seal that should have held was broken from the wrong side. Trevor cursed under his breath. Dracula's eyes narrowed and did not widen again. At the heart of the castle, the primordial reached the throne itself. It laid a hand upon the obsidian, and the castle stopped obeying Dracula. Every corridor, every wall, every whisper. The kingdom of eternal night had a new master, and it did not know mercy. The final battle did not begin. It simply became unavoidable, the way a tide becomes unavoidable when the moon rises above a low coast. Every thread of the story pulled taut at once, and the castle, which had stopped being a castle, became the meeting place of every reality that had ever touched it. Trevor stood upon a bridge of stone that hung above three skies. One sky burned with the red of hell. One sky churned with the eternal storm of Castlevania. One sky was a color he had no word for, and the murals from the cathedral below flickered within it like memory. The primordial revealed itself fully then, and the revelation was worse than the shape. It spoke, though not aloud, and its speaking placed knowledge into their minds like sediment into water. It was not a demon born of hell. It was an architect. It had drawn the first blueprints of infernal realms in ages before this world had cooled. It had touched countless kingdoms across countless realities, seeding the same rot in each, harvesting the despair as slowly as a farmer harvests grain. Dracula's empire, its cruelties and its curses, had been in some sense its child, though a child raised in ignorance of its parent. Dracula heard this and did not flinch, but something in him settled. He had believed, for all his long years, that his suffering had made him. He now understood that his suffering had been cultivated. His vengeance had been useful to something older than his grief, and that something had used the centuries he offered. He turned to the Slayer. There were no speeches. Between them at last was only the recognition of two beings who had walked too far to be turned back by pride. "You destroy," Dracula said. "I preserve. That is why we differ." The Slayer's helm turned toward him. "You preserve," Dracula continued, "so that hope survives. I preserved so that my grief would." He did not add the rest. He did not need to. They fought together. Trevor fought beside them, and he was under no illusion about his place. He was a mortal on a battlefield of legends. But mortals, he had always been taught, were the reason legends existed at all. He carried holy water to those who could not reach it. He drew off swarms so the giants could strike. He set a foot upon a ledge that would not have held two, and cast a rope across a chasm that should not have been crossed, and one of the two giants crossed it, and that was enough. Death made his move in the second hour. Trevor could not later recall the exact moment, only that a corridor twisted and a doorway offered itself, and Death stepped through with his hand outstretched to touch the primordial and claim its inheritance. The primordial did not laugh. It did not need to. It simply opened, and Death, who had presumed himself the master of endings, learned that some endings mastered him. His robe collapsed inward. His scythe fell from a hand that no longer existed. Trevor did not mourn him. He noted him and moved on. The plan came together without being spoken. Dracula reached inward, and the castle, though it no longer obeyed him, remembered him. He drew upon every dark power he had ever hoarded, every curse he had ever inherited, every drop of magic that had ever passed through obsidian, and he poured it not into himself but into a cage. The cage held the primordial for the length of a held breath, long enough for the Slayer, unhurried even now, to close the distance and answer the architect the way he had answered every architect before it. The physical form broke. What broke it was not spectacle, it was refusal. The Slayer's refusal, unchanging across worlds, that this evil would not persist in his sight. The castle shattered with it, not fell, shattered. The eternal machinery that had allowed it to rise from every burning simply stopped, the way a heart stops when the argument for beating has finally been won by silence. Dracula stood at the center of the shattering. He did not run. He looked once at Trevor. He inclined his head, the smallest gesture of a very old man, and then he stepped backward into the collapsing dark, taking his centuries with him. The Slayer stood alone upon a ledge that was becoming sky. Trevor found him there afterward. There were no words worth speaking. The wind carried the smell of rain and iron, and somewhere far below, a bell that no one had rung began slowly to ring itself once and then no more. Months passed, and the world did what worlds do when the largest shadow finally lifts. It did not celebrate. It exhaled. Villages that had lived under the shape of the castle upon the horizon slowly forgot to look toward the horizon at all. Children born in that first spring would grow up without the taste of iron in the wind, and they would never quite believe their grandparents when the old stories were told. Night creatures became rare, then rumor of rumor. Wolves became wolves again, dangerous but honest. The blood moons that had marked the calendar of a dozen generations gave way to moons of ordinary silver. Priests found their prayers answered faster than they remembered. Farmers found their harvests heavier than they deserved. Small mercies. But the accumulation of small mercies is what a world uses to convince itself it is healing. Trevor Belmont became the last living witness to a history most refused to believe. He told his tale once, in full, to a scribe in a warm inn, and the scribe wrote it down and then hid the pages, because he did not wish to be laughed at by other scribes. Trevor did not tell the tale again. He carried it as one carries a saint's relic, close and rarely displayed. He trained his son when a son came, and he did not tell the boy of the armored giant, because some inheritances must be earned rather than given. The legends grew in his absence, as legends do. Some said the armored figure had been a holy knight, sent by a god who had grown at last impatient with the suffering of the faithful. Some said he had been divine punishment, a scourge sent to end an empire that had ripened past mercy. Vampires, in the few dim covens that survived, told a different story to their fledglings. They spoke of the night when fear had changed sides. They spoke of a stranger who had walked through their kind the way a man walks through wheat, and they warned the young not to seek him, because seeking him was how one found him. Scholars, drawn to the ruins as scholars always are, began to sift. In a chamber untouched by the collapse, beneath layers of stone that should not have survived, they found more of the murals. The armored figure appeared again and again and again, in different armors, in different ages, standing before different demons in different skies, always in the same posture. The scholars argued. Some said it was a single soul, sent across realities like a letter across a road. Some said it was a lineage, a duty passed from champion to champion, unknown to any of them. Some quietly wondered whether the figure was not a person at all but a promise, made by something older than persons, that no darkness would be permitted a permanent throne. The Slayer himself did not stay to hear these theories. On a morning when the sky above the ruined mountain was, for the first time in centuries, an ordinary blue, a new breach opened in the air near the foundations. It was small and it flickered like a candle in a draught. He walked to it without ceremony. He did not look back at Trevor, standing at the edge of a broken wall. He did not need to. Trevor lifted his hand once, and the armored figure paused for the length of a breath and then stepped through. The breach closed behind him. The wind returned to being wind. In a chamber deeper than any scholar had found, beneath rubble no shovel would move, a single black ember continued to glow. It was not Dracula's power. It was not the primordial's essence. It was older still, and it was not alone. Across countless worlds, embers like it burned in forgotten places, patient as the silence in a forest before a stranger walks through it. The Slayer's war did not end with the castle. It only continued elsewhere. Somewhere in another sky, another world was waiting. It did not yet know it was waiting, but the ember knew.